lecture very much. This is somewhat, part of this was somewhat technical, but the way you explained it was absolutely clear. Maybe I can start with one comment. I mean, I think you showed this brilliantly. This ESBI's idea, so this European safe asset, is a kind of a two-sided coin. So on the association people have in Germany mostly is, oh, this is Eurobonds by the back door. What I like about this approach, though, is that it does introduce some element of market discipline. In fact, if you think about it, and I think that's the reason why the Italian government doesn't like it, it would make government debt restructuring possible. Because you have the junior tranche. And contrary to the current situation where banks, hold all this government debt, they wouldn't hold the junior tranche. I would expect this to have a massive impact on markets. I'm sure that Italian government bond yields would surge if that came. Unless there was a kind of a dominating expectation that this is Eurobonds through the back door, so that policymakers would then intervene and say markets are going wrong again, and they would introduce some kind of market intervention as you described, and eventually move this towards Eurobonds, which would then have the opposite effect. I guess this is an open question. I mean, we emphasize this issue that in this letter you mentioned that we wouldn't like privileges for government bonds to be extended to new instruments. And we also emphasize this political risk. And I guess one key issue is how would national governments sell their bonds to this entity, to these entities, and of course, if it works well, the yields on Greek government bonds, Italian government bonds would be much higher than now. And that would probably be the politically critical moment where people would say, no, that was not the idea. The idea was, to bring these yields together or whatever. Okay, so are there questions, comments on this presentation, please?
Oh, yeah.
Thank you very much. Many thanks for this very interesting presentation. I enjoyed it very much. Indeed, I work in banking union related matters, not only in my PhD thesis, but I also work at the Spanish Treasury and in the Euro area, so I'm quite involved in these type of things. So I think this is indeed very, very good. So it's true that the ESRB is now defending this idea of the SBVS. You came up with a different proposal. But it's not only, for instance, the Italian government or the Spanish government of governments of Southern European member states not wishing to see the initiative put on the table by the ESRB, not yours. It's also the German government, the German DMO, the Finnish DMO. So I think that for different reasons. I think that the Southern European member states see this as a risk reduction measure, whereas Northern European member states see this as a risk sharing measure. To us, I mean, this is not, in Spain, I mean, this is not sovereign Eurobonds through the back door. We see no risk sharing element at all. Indeed, we see the disciplining effect. But Mr. Fues, you made reference to the fact that this would enable, for instance, sovereign debt restructuring mechanism. It would make it easier. But do you think that this would in any case still be desirable given what we saw in Deauville in 2010? Do you think that things would change very much? And then if this type of idea would have, second question, if this type of idea would have a massive impact, for instance, on the Italian sovereign debt market, given the fact that Italian is the third euro area economy, is this desirable, or could we be in dire straits if that was to happen? Thank you.
Yeah, maybe I'll start. So what I said in the beginning is that obviously a suggestion that needs to be crafted, needs to take into account that not changing, say from today to tomorrow, a system which actually could create significant problems. Nonetheless, the real challenge is that banks are so overly exposed to sovereign debt that this needs to come to an end. So we need to at least create the expectation that this is now brought backwards. And therefore, what we suggest here is to say, let's take maybe 5 years or let's take 10 years really to bring it back back into order, because it also has built up over a pretty significant period of time. So therefore, and still not putting hard constraints, but rather giving pure incentives about diversification, because in that sense, if then there should be a default by a given country, it would not mean immediately that all the banks in a given country would have to be recapitalized, but rather in that sense we have a more integrated financial market, and therefore also the burden is taken or is carried by many more.
So I think that there were discussions in Basel in this regard. So when the roadmap of the banking union was agreed in June 2016, it was decided to wait until Basel discussions came to a conclusion to see how sovereign exposures would have to be treated. So now it seems that Basel has decided not to go down that road. So don't you think that this could hurt the level playing field of the euro area vis-a-vis other major economic regions in the world?
So I know this argument is often made. So that means that you see a different regulation for, say, US banks or say Japanese banks in this regard. So therefore, again, what we would suggest here is, if you diversify your portfolio, there's no disadvantage that you would face against those banks. And so, and again, having a, say, substantial transition period of a couple of years would then, again, not put any disadvantage to those banks if one followed this approach.
Very briefly on your point about Deauville, I think if we increase market discipline now, what's good about that is that we get closer to proper pricing of new debt, and that's what we want. So we don't want to set incentive to extend debt just because there is a guarantee by the ECB. We also increase the cost of refinancing the existing stock of debt. So the old debt, I guess that's more a distributional issue. It's not good or bad. The question is, for this, let's say, this mountain of Italian debt, who pays for it? Is it the Italian taxpayer, do they get a guarantee from the rest of the Eurozone to reduce the cost? So, my concern is mostly new debt. I'm worried about the artificial reduction of the pricing of new debt. This is a clear incentive to go into excessive debt, but past debt is a problem. I totally agree. So there was more. Maybe we should collect a little bit.
Please.
It's one more question here, then one over there. Hans-Werner. These four, okay, and then we should conclude.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for the nice discussion and the nice presentation. My name is Atanas Pekanov. I work at the Austrian Institute for Economic Research, WIFO, in Vienna. I have another question about the SPs, or as they're now called SPSS. It's coming from another branch of the critiques towards the suggestion. It's more about, so Erik Nielsen posted this 2 weeks ago in his Sunday Raps, the chief economist of UniCredit, and he is criticizing from another point of view, saying, isn't that basically a government CDO, so you basically diversify, but even in the problem here is in comparison to the CDOs in the US, which were already pretty problematic, I would say. Here you have even less assets, and you can diversify throughout assets that are much more correlated. And he says, well, basically this is a similar kind of financial engineering as before the crisis, and this could then be again leading to not proper pricing of the risks, and could lead to long-term dangers. So what's your point of view on this?
Let's take our questions together just for time. We can pass it on to the...
Hi, I'm Guillaume Claver. I'm from the Paris School of Economics and the OECD. Thank you for your presentation. 2 quick questions and 1 remark. In the first part of your presentation, you've highlighted reasons why the banking system would hold a very high amount of sovereign debt, but why would they hold a high portion of that of domestic debt? Was it the redomination risk, for example, do you think? Then a remark on the SBVS. There was a note circulated by Standard & Poor's, maybe it's the one that you cited, showing really bad early market signals. They would rate really low these kind of instruments if it was to be implemented. We were not even sure if they would hold the senior amount. And then a question about your proposal. If I understand correctly, the amount past the capital key would be regulated, but how? What do you propose as regulation? Would it be capital requirements or limits?
Yeah, concerning first the SBs, Markus Brunnermeier was here. I asked him exactly this question, who buys the junior bonds? He did not answer it, but in an earlier presentation he had said and written, I think, that the ECB buys them. So the whole trick is to bring the junior bonds to some government institution. At least the institution that issues the whole thing would then be liable. It would not find anyone, and so it would be a huge debt mutualization event. In my opinion, what Warren Buffett said about ABS papers, which this is, that they are a weapon of mass destruction, applies perfectly. Because Europe will be driven into a debt avalanche of the kind the Americans had in their first decades after they mutualized the debt of the states. It would be a disaster for Europe. Everything else, I think this is tricky argument of third order, but this is the major element, and this is also the reason why over-indebted countries want that so urgently. Your proposal with the capital key purchases, maybe you can clarify, does every bank have to buy in proportion, or is this just a maximum they can buy? That I would find essential, because otherwise you would artificially create the demand for very risky government bonds and thereby drive down the spreads. Concerning the doom loop, here, I think one historical aspect should be kept in mind. The doom loop is of course bad, but it is not so bad as it is often said, because the alternative to channeling the funds of the ECB through the banking sector would be for the ECB to buy the government bonds directly. And this was heavily discussed at the time when the Maastricht Treaty was made, and Germany at the time insisted, no, this is not possible, because we had that in the Weimar Republic. It generated a hyperinflation. The governments serviced themselves with the printing presses. You know, and therefore, one had Article 125 of the Treaty for the European Union, which is now 125, which says, no, this cannot be done. The money from the printing press cannot go directly to the government. We need the banks in between, so that the banks would control and bear the risk. If they invest then in government bonds, it's their business. So we have a market institution here to make sure that governments cannot that easily finance one another. So the possible bankruptcy of banks was intended, in a sense. What now is called a doom loop was an intended element of self-control, of market control against this fear of self-serving service with the printing press. But of course, we know also the downsides. I don't want to play that down. You pointed out correctly, and so European diversification elements would be certainly very good. But why is not a simple solution to say that each bank just can hold a certain fraction of its equity of any government bond period without and here I did not fully understand what you really propose, without imposing the requirement on a bank. If they buy government bonds of one country, they have to buy them of another country too. Do you want that, or don't you want that? If you don't, I think your proposal is great. If you want to buy force banks to buy government bonds from states which they would not voluntarily otherwise have bought, I see a problem.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll make it very short. I have one comment or question actually. So in the beginning you made always this comparison between corporate debt and sovereign debt, arguing that sovereign debt has kind of privileges. And so basically what you say is that both are equal to some extent in your point of view. But are they really equal? because I don't think so. And this is one of the main advantages of sovereign debt, is the government can tax and so on. So just one point on this. And the second point is on the sovereign doom loop. You talked about the proposal, but you haven't talked about the 3 basic pillars of the banking union, for instance. So I would just like to hear your point of view on the European deposit insurance as a German economist. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Jörg has just written on the deposit insurance, so I'm sure you can answer that question.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for all the questions. I hope to be able to address them. So first of all, I would not require, our suggestion would not require these banks to invest in countries they don't want to invest in, but it would still then, in that sense, it would then create a capital charge that they would have to keep. So it's in that sense there's no must, but there is an incentive to do so. And we rule out from this capital key all those countries which are currently in have a rating that is not investable into. So this means if there is a country that has a C rating or so, then obviously this would not be part of the capital key that would be suggested to those banks, and one could adjust the ratings accordingly. And I think I could relate one question here regarding, so why do they actually buy these assets? The good argument could be to say, in fact, we want to use an institution that has to face bankruptcy risk, so therefore put a little bit of market discipline into it. The counter argument is, this is a political economy argument in which the sovereign debt office calls a bank and says, please buy our debt. There's no problem for you because you can immediately use that debt, use it as collateral vis-a-vis the central bank, and therefore there could be a lot of pressure by governments on their local banks, because they could put pressures in all kinds of way to say, please buy it, and it's not to your disadvantage. You can just simply bring it to the central bank and use it as collateral there. So. I think the first question was related to the question of correlation. In fact, this is the big question. So as I mentioned, correlation matrices that are now used for calculation might completely be different from those that are used later on in figuring out what is the right composition and how to figure out the junior, the senior, and other tranches. So therefore, this is, I think, the key element that needs to be looked at. So let's see. Deposit insurance. Deposit insurance, as I said, I wrote an article on this last week, and it actually relates to what we discussed here. So at the point of time where there are significant risks in bank balance sheets, so where banks hold significant amounts of sovereign debt, in which also the bad loans on these bank balance sheets are significant. So the European Commission last week said, or the week before said, 950 billion of bad loans on balance sheets of European banks. And in particular, at a point of time where the distribution of those risks is not, you could say, synchronous, or it's not the same across countries, but rather you have huge differences in some countries where bad loans make up a significant double-digit percentage of bank balance sheets. It would, in my view, not be a real insurance mechanism at this point of time, but rather a transfer mechanism that would be put into place. So therefore, the original idea by the Commission to first say, let's reduce the risks of the balance sheets and then discuss whether we want to go for a deposit insurance, I think is absolutely to the point. It would really, in my view, it would really destroy the commitment to Europe if we now started this mechanism and then saw risks that were created under the responsibility of individual member states would then be carried over to the European level and had to be taken or covered by other countries, or say depositors and potentially taxpayers in other countries. So maybe a last point. I think that is something to also take, you could say, a more positive way and thinking about what else Europe could do. The one argument that's often made is the following: that whenever you see shocks reaching the euro system, that these shocks are mainly covered or have to be mainly covered by taxpayers, so by fiscal authorities. The empirical studies in the United States show that the fiscal buffers are important, but even more important are capital market buffers. So when, for example, there's a widely spread and diversified portfolio, then whatever a problem arises, there are also capital market participants who can take the hit. And that, in that sense, would induce us to think much more strongly about the question of how we can integrate capital markets in Europe more. So how we can actually induce investors in different countries to give their capital also to other countries, obviously only under the condition that also the conditions for investments in other countries are met, so that there is sufficient the rule of law, that insolvency mechanisms and so on are much more efficient. But that might be one way to push for European integration without going for risk mutualization.
Thank you very much, Jörg. Let me take up this last point. There is an Econpol paper, a recent Econpol paper about shocks in the Eurozone, showing that they are quite synchronized, and also showing that exactly this mechanism through capital market integration has a lot more potential than what we can expect in terms of fiscal equalization at the moment. So I think this was a tremendous and fascinating start to the conference, Jörg. Thank you very much. Thanks to all of you for discussing, and enjoy the coffee break. Thank you.
Thank you. Gut. Ich bleib noch ein bisschen hier. Ja, genau.